Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 18 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host this evening, Andrew de Blok, coming to you live from Johannesburg. We have over 140 episodes of our series already. If you're joining us for the first one, you're very, very welcome. But if you've missed any of our episodes, you can go and catch those up on YouTube. Just search for BirdLife South Africa. And you can find all of our episodes there. Tonight, we have one of Africa's best young conservationists here to talk to us about his studies on DDT in birds of prey. He is literally an award-winning presenter. We're all very excited to hear what has happened in the 60 years since this toxin was first identified as a threat to raptors. And Kailen has been recognized as one of Africa's top 100 youth conservation leaders. I mentioned early on that he's an award-winning speaker. I've seen him present at multiple conferences, and we're in for a treat. He's a great speaker and he has great things to talk about as well. He's the co-founder of KNAV Conservation Foundation, a non-profit conservation education organization based in South Africa. He has 14 years of experience in various sectors of the wildlife and environmental conservation industry, with his expertise in raptor conservation and ecology, ecotoxicology, snare poaching, the illegal bush meat trade, and environmental education. He's an honorary research fellow at the University of Witwatersrand and serves on multiple boards dedicated to wildlife and environmental conservation, including the Magaliesberg UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and the National Lead Task Team. Kailen's work in conservation has been internationally recognized, being nominated as a Future for Nature Award finalist in 2020 and recognized as one of Africa's top 100 youth conservation leaders in 2021. His MTech research focused on assessing and comparing the diets of urban and rural Verreaux's eagles. So we're talking about how Verreaux's eagles came up as everyone's favorite raptor, it seems, from our popularity poll. So you're in good hands tonight. And this was focused in the Magaliesberg and Soutpansberg. He's currently a doctoral student at the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology, where his thesis is exploring raptors as sentinel species to monitor environmental contamination in South Africa. So I mentioned I was present at the Owl Awards just a couple of hours ago at BirdLife South Africa. One of our VIP guests was Siobhan Reynolds from University of Wits, who I believe is one of your co-supervisors, along with Prof. Arjun Amar from the Fitz. So Kailen, both your supervisors hold you in very high esteem. They're very excited to see where your work can go. I believe there's potential submissions to science, and we're going to see some of that data in our presentation today. So ladies and gents, you're in for some cutting edge science, some groundbreaking work. And Kailen, we're very excited to see what you have to tell us tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for that introduction, Andrew. I forgot some of the stuff that you actually mentioned, so thank you very much. I saw a lot of people were very interested in Verreaux's eagle, and it's always a surprise to most that Verreaux's eagle isn't actually even on my top 10. But I was surprised to see that no one said bat hawk. I mean, those are the most amazing little things
I know
have in Southern Africa. But yeah, that's shocking. But thank you again for that introduction. Let me and I apologize, I'm sitting in the dark here, courtesy of ESCOM. So let me share my screen quickly.
If you are more comfortable turning your video off while you present, you're welcome to do that as well. And we can see your screen very well.
Perfect. Yeah, I might actually do that just to make sure that I save as much battery as possible. So I'm gonna pop that off. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thanks again, Andrew, for that introduction, and of course to all of you for joining. It's so great to see so many people interested in this topic. It's something, as Andrew mentioned, it's something that I've been working on for the last few years. And I heard that Rob Simmons is in the audience. In fact, he was himself, Rob and Marie-Sophie they were the inspiration for this work in the beginning with their work on black harriers, so in the Western Cape. So they inspired the work that I've started for my PhD. So today, as I mentioned, or as the title suggests, we're going to be speaking about DDT, a chemical that everybody loves to hate, but very few people actually know what it stands for. And so it's a word, it's quite a mouthful, so I'll read it out to you. It's dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. Very long word, but it's something that we all heard about, and we've all had at one stage or another an opinion on it. But we won't be just talking about DDT. We'll talk about other organochlorines that we've been picking up in raptors throughout the world as well. Now, before we get into DDT itself, there was the whole reason for why DDT and other pesticides came about was to protect us against pests, right? And pests have been part of our societies for centuries. Some of the biggest plagues, in fact, were spread by pests. If we think back to the 1300s, the bubonic plague or Black Death was actually spread by infected rat fleas. That's a pest that's still a problem today in certain parts of the world. But it wasn't just diseases, right? It was also food security. There's been stories of catastrophic famine that have been caused by pests like locusts that go through a field and just destroy everything. I mean, for example, back in Algeria, back in the early mid 1800s, Algeria experienced a really bad famine caused by these locusts that actually ended up wiping out 5% of their population during that period. So whether it's disease or whether it's food security, these pests can and have caused really tremendous damages to the economy, to our population. And so it's no surprise that we would be finding ways to protect ourselves, finding ways to make sure that we limit the impact of these pest species. And in fact, the first known pesticide use by humans to control pests was back in 2500 BC by the Sumerians, where they used sulfur to deter invertebrate pests from crops and food stores. So it's pests as well as pesticides have been part of our community for centuries. And like it or not, they've played a very big role in where we are today as human beings, with our food security and with our ability to protect ourselves against terrible diseases. But as humans evolve and as our technologies evolve, so did our ability to protect ourselves and create new and more powerful pesticides. We went from using pretty benign concoctions, really, plant extracts and things like that, to really serious toxic synthetic pesticides that are very effective at controlling pests. And one of the biggest, or one of the best known and most dangerous groups are your organochlorine pesticides. And that's the group which DDT belongs to. And that's where this study actually began. So DDT was first synthesized in 1939 and was used in World War II to protect the soldiers, the coalition soldiers, against diseases such as typhus and malaria. And it did a really, really good job. So much so that by the end of the war, 1945, the Swiss chemist that synthesized or rather discovered the insecticidal properties of DDT was awarded a Nobel Prize for this amazing miracle chemical. He did such a great job. They gave him a Nobel Prize. And after the war was over, well, there was no need to protect soldiers anymore. So we decided to make DDT available to the public, to be used as an agricultural pesticide to protect our food, as well as to protect people from malaria and other diseases throughout the world. Now, if you take a look on that right-hand side of that screen, you see those kind of comic strips. Those are actual adverts back in the 1940s, and they sing the praises of DDT. This was literally a miracle chemical that was going to save us from everything imaginable. And unfortunately, those often jovial catchphrases and clever catchphrases they belie really DDT's much more sinister side. So you see, the general problem with DDT is that while it's not the most toxic chemical in the world, it's extremely resistant to environmental degradation. In fact, OCPs can be characterized by three major properties. And the first is that they are extremely resistant to environmental degradation. So they don't break down very easily in the environment. They tend to persist for many, many years. Secondly, they're able to travel very long distances, either by air currents or ocean currents. And the fact that they don't break down in the environment aids them in this. So often we're finding very high amounts or for high levels of not only DDT, but organochlorines in general, far away from their initial source. And then thirdly is that these pesticides, specifically DDT, are bioaccumulative. So they accumulate in the ecosystem and at successive trophic levels. So what that means is that as the ecosystem is contaminated by DDT, it's taken up by the plants, it's taken up by various different prey species. As those prey species are eaten by predators at higher trophic levels, so these contaminants kind of accumulate as they climb up that ladder. And once you get to the top, to the apex predators on your in your food chain, that's where these chemicals accumulate. And in our case, raptors are perfect apex predators. They occupy every continent on Earth except for Antarctica, and so in most of the ecosystems that they occur in, they sit at the top of that the trophic level of the food chain, rather. Nothing really eats them, and so these chemicals accumulate in these raptors, and being a long-lived species, most of them, they can live to accumulate quite high amounts in their bodies. DDT and organochlorines in general are what we refer to as lipophilic. So they bind to lipids, fat, which is high in fat or fatty organs. And the higher the concentration of these chemicals get, the more the chance of serious health implications, such as acute neurological damage, endocrine disorders, and for us as conservationists specifically, when it comes to the conservation of species, reproductive failure. So obviously, if the species struggle to reproduce, there's a chance that we'll start having a decline in numbers as we go further on. And so this pesticide is very, very well linked to that in birds in particular. So, as I said, reproductive damage to reproductive productivity is a problem when it comes to DDT, because DDT was specifically linked to eggshell thinning in birds in general, but raptors in particular. So what happens is, as it accumulates in the body, specifically your females, they shed their DDT into their eggs when they lay their eggs, and the higher the amount of DDT in the eggs, we found reduces the thickness of the shell. And obviously, thinner shells will result in eggs breaking under the weight of incubating parents. And that, of course, that's where your reproductive depression comes in, is where if enough eggs break within that population, within an area, within an ecosystem, fewer birds are being born, and so we're reducing the numbers of a number of birds in that population. And we saw this specifically in the Northern Hemisphere, in the UK and North America, during the time of peak DDT use, when things like peregrine falcons specifically started to dramatically decline, and it was linked to DDT in their eggshells. A book that some of you may remember or know, by a person named Rachel Carson. This book was called Silent Spring. Phenomenal book, and I do suggest that if you can get your hands on it, go over it. It is a great book for anybody that is interested in pesticide use, but also birds and the impact of pesticides. It was also a book that arguably created the biggest movement in banning or reducing these organochlorines worldwide. It was because of this book that governments all over the world decided to start banning DDT specifically, because it was bringing up all these impacts on our raptors. Not only on the peregrine falcon, but the bald eagle in North America, and even the Eurasian sparrowhawk in parts of Europe, were all seeing similar declines because of this eggshell thinning. And because of that, these species quickly started becoming the center of many investigations into DDT's impact on the environment, with raptors in general all over the world becoming these sentinel species, or these biological indicators that warn us against the indiscriminate use of DDT in particular. So much so that after a while, all these studies kind of grew and grew over time, and a movement started to form a international convention to monitor and to kind of maintain and mitigate the impacts of DDT and other organochlorines on the environment. And that was the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. It was ratified in 2004 by, I believe it was about 90 different nations around the world that said, right, this is a really big problem, and we need to have an immediate action. And the immediate action was to completely ban DDT, completely ban it throughout the world. No longer allowed to make it, no longer allowed to use it. However, about 2 years later, the World Health Organization actually supported the restricted reintroduction of DDT in certain tropical developing countries, or in other words, the global south. And this was in direct reaction to the growing number of malaria cases. DDT was just really good at killing mosquitoes and therefore protecting humans against things like malaria, which of course in the global south is still a problem. I mean, we still have a huge issue in Africa with malaria, and DDT was what was seen to be the silver bullet for that. And so that what resulted was the continued use, also continued production of DDT, but only in these global south countries under very restricted conditions. Nevertheless, raptors started acting as really important sentinel species. And because of that, government agencies and researchers from all over the world started to recognize the value of these birds as a monitoring tool, specifically for DDT. Remember, these birds sit at the top of these food chains, and so that's where all of these chemicals kind of accumulate. And so we can use them as, we refer to them as sentinel species, but they're basically biological indicators. They help us, they're indicators of ecosystem health. And it helps us make proactive, by studying them, we can make proactive conservation decisions regarding many different things, but in this case, different types of chemicals, specifically DDT. And because there was so much, I mean, what you see on your screen there is a very small sample of the data that's available out there. It's a huge amount of data. And so because there was so much, we decided to do a review of our own. And this title that you see here is a paper that we published a little earlier this year. And what we did is we took advantage of this huge amount of monitoring that's taken place throughout the world. And we decided to collate it all, get an understanding of what's been done, how has it been done, and what are the levels looking like now around the world in DDT. And what we found is that within the 250 studies that we reviewed, these studies assessed DDT specifically in 27,000 individual raptors. In fact, a little bit more than 27,000. And those 27,000 raptors came from 114 different species. So that was a huge amount of data. So I'm not going to go into the immense amount of analysis, but I want to show you just briefly what we found. So our idea was that, well, DDT is a global issue. It's something that affects everybody on Earth. So because of that, we expect the samples to be collected relatively evenly throughout the world, right? Especially because there's parts of the world where this pesticide is still being used. And so, yeah, we expect samples to be coming evenly from all over the world. And that was not at all what we found. In fact, 95% of samples were collected only in the global north, and specifically North America and Europe. 95%. It's a huge bias, huge bias. So that leaves only 5% of samples being collected spread across South America, Africa, Asia, and Australasia. But hold on a second. Australasia, places like Australia and New Zealand, those are actually considered global north. So they're developed countries. So in fact, it's less than 5% of samples that have come from countries and regions that still produce or use DDT currently. So in other words, what that's showing us is we've made a lot of these decisions and we've built a lot of the data in our conventions around information that's coming from a region that doesn't even use DDT anymore and hasn't used it from the mid-1970s. But in contrast, very little is coming from countries that are still using it, which is a potential issue for us. Not only that, but from those 114 species, now 114 species is about 20% of global raptor species, all right? So it's not huge, but it's about 20%, so not too bad. From that 114 species, just 3 of them accounted for 50% of all samples. And that's the bald eagle, the Eurasian sparrowhawk, and the peregrine falcon. 2 of them only occur in the global north. They occur in North America and Europe. Only the peregrine falcon occurs throughout the world. So again, a huge amount of bias on where we're getting this information and how this information that we're using to base a lot of our decisions, our conservation decisions, and our decisions around DDT use. So nevertheless, that is how DDT monitoring in raptors has been studied and monitored globally over the last 60 years or so. Once we kind of outlined that, we wanted to understand, what are the levels looking like? Sure, that's how we've monitored it. That's the effort that's been put into the research. But what are the levels looking like? And so we went to each and every study and we extracted DDT levels from those 27 raptors. So each individual raptor was studied in their papers, and concentrations were given, whether it was concentrations in liver, concentrations in fat, whatever it is, they gave us those levels of DDT, and it was over the 60 years. So what you're seeing on your screen now is an example of the data that we were presented with. This is a graph that comes from white-tailed sea eagles in Sweden. This particular population was studied from 1965, in fact, a little bit before 1965, and they've displayed data all the way to 2005. So the bottom line you can see is the year. On the left is the concentration of DDE. Now, DDE is simply a breakdown substance of DDT. It's a metabolite. So DDT breaks down into 3 different metabolites: DDT, DDE, and DDD. But DDE in particular is the specific metabolite that was linked to the eggshell thinning in birds when it comes to DDT. And so what they found in this particular study is that as the DDE levels in birds or in eggshells decline, so the DDT in Sweden was banned, completely banned, around the 1960s. So you're talking about mid-1960s. So you can see on that graph, 1965, it was relatively high, you're looking at around 1200 ppm in eggshells. And so what happened was After the banning, there was obviously no DDT entering the system. So as it declined, that squiggly line in the middle there, that is the average productivity. So you can see that as DDE declined in eggshells, the population of the white-tailed sea eagle started to recover, which is fantastic news. It shows us that if we stop using this pesticide, we reduce the amount entering the system. While it is persistent and it does carry on, it does persist in the environment for a while, it does decline. And with that decline, populations of affected animals can actually recover. Very, very encouraging. And this is great news. However, this study, as well as all the other ones that we were afforded, look at a single species from a single region. So it's not giving us a global view, a wider understanding. It's even giving us data from a country that has stopped using DDT altogether. So we're not too sure whether it's going to be representative. And what we wanted to know is, what is DDT doing around the world? It's great to see that it may be declining in Sweden and populations are increasing, but that's such a small space, such a small region at the top of the world. What is happening at a larger scale, a global scale? And so we did a lot of maths, which I'm not going to subject you all to today. But of course, at any time, if anybody wants to chat about it, you're welcome to contact me afterwards, and we can talk about the models that we drew up. But basically, drum roll, please. What we found was this graph, and what that tells us is we are winning. DDT is declining across the world. So we took into account a lot of different variables, different countries, whether it was banned, whether it was restricted. And what we found, in a nutshell, is that DDT is in fact declining in raptors throughout the world, irrespective of whether it's being used currently or whether it has been completely banned. So we are winning this. You can see that red line on the graph there is the point where DDT was either banned or severely restricted in the world. And DDT continues. So before that line on the left-hand side of the line, it's high and it's expected. That was the peak use of DDT. But as it goes along, just after the line, it kind of remains the same as it goes, which is understandable. As a persistent pollutant, it's going to remain relatively stable. But then soon after, probably about 10 to 15 years after, it starts to decline, and it continues to decline. So this is fantastic news for us as not only as ecotoxicologists, but as conservation managers that are worried about the effects of this type of toxin on our wildlife, especially in countries like South Africa that still use it. We are winning. This is a declining trend. Yes, I must admit there is a little bit of bias in this data, but the models did take into consideration a lot of that bias, and we still came out with a declining trend, which is fantastic news. You can see from here, we looked at it from continent to continent. And still, we didn't find a difference. The only difference we found was between Asia and North America. And that basically says that North American raptors have higher DDT levels than Asian raptors. However, this may be on account to bias in the data itself. So when we were doing the review, we do believe that we missed out on a lot of non-English papers. And that could be the reason why we're seeing such a difference. It could also be due to how DDT was used in Asia compared to North America, and for how long it was used in each site. But definitely something that we need to take a closer look into, but it's probably explained by a little bit of bias in the data itself. What we also did was we split it up a little bit. We looked at our raptors in two different dietary gills. Okay, very broad dietary gills. We know that not all of these raptors are strictly piscivorous species, but the majority of the time they feed on fish. So we grouped them into an aquatic dietary gill, So any raptor that would feed predominantly on fish versus a terrestrial dietary gill. So anything that feeds on anything else other than fish, basically. So even scavengers were grouped into that terrestrial group. And what we found is that your aquatic raptors had higher levels of DDT, but those levels of DDT were declining slower than the terrestrial bunch, which is kind of expected, right? Because that DDT, as I said, it's persistent in the environment. So things like precipitation could affect the runoff of those chemicals into waterways, which are then carried away. So it looks as though it's leaving the terrestrial ecosystem faster, but it's accumulating in the aquatic ecosystems, especially in your coastal areas or in your rivers. So we expected that type of trend when it comes to these two different dietary gills. But all in all, as we said, as we said when we started this, is what is DDT doing globally? And we can confidently say that it is declining. It is going down. It's definitely affected by bias. So if we look at, for example, the aquatic guild, the aquatic dietary guild, that aquatic dietary guild is dominated by your bald eagle. Now, we all know we don't get bald eagles anywhere else other than North America, all right? So for bald eagles to make up 52% of that dietary guild, there's definitely bias in there. So it is something that we need to continue working at. But again, I'll bring you back to this phenomenal graph. With everything taken into account, these levels are declining. They are going down. And not only are they going down, they're showing us that if we adhere to the rules and regulations set out by your international agreements like the Stockholm Convention, it is possible for us to make a difference in these in these types of contaminations. So the Stockholm Convention, the whole point of why they were established was to protect us, to reduce the amount of these contaminants in the environment. And this graph, at least in South Africa, oh, sorry, I lied, not in South Africa. This is global. This graph is showing us that it can do it in the face of the lack of monitoring continuing in South Africa. So it is a great advocate for these conventions. I mean, not always, these conventions don't always work. We know there are shortfalls in a lot of them, and we know that not all of them are able to reach their mandates. And there's always opinions on whether it's even worth it. They cost a lot of money and a lot of effort to put together. But we can definitely, as a global community, do our part. This is a perfect example of it. And that's why I love to end my talks on this subject with this graph, because it shows us there's hope that we can continue doing this. There's still a lot of work to be done in the global south. There's still a lot of work to be done in South Africa, where we know we continue to use not only DDT, but many other pesticides. Can we meet the needs of humans while not contaminating our ecosystems and our non-target species? And I would like to say yes, we can. We've shown with this data that we can do that. We can save lives, because as we said in the beginning, malaria is still a big problem. We are still losing many people to malaria. We need something that is cost effective and efficient at protecting people against malaria, but we cannot sacrifice our environment and our ecosystems to do that. And I think if we continue on the route that we're going, especially with organic chlorine pesticides, we have a chance of doing that. But we still need a lot more data from South Africa and other global South nations that continue to use these pesticides. But yes, this is a good news story, and we don't, in conservation, we're not always in the position to to finish off a talk or a presentation with good news. Today, I am very happy that we're able to do that. I'm able to show you something that is hopeful and that we can use going forward. So thanks, guys. I didn't want to take too much of your time on that and go too much into the science, but thank you to the following organizations that actually made the study possible. And I hope you all stand by. We have a lot more data coming up from other papers that is going to shed a light on not only DDT, but also other organochlorine pesticides. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Kailen. It's always good to have good news in conservation. I think we can get drowned in some bad news sometimes, but it seems we got some good news to report on this front, which is always nice. Thank you for sharing that with us and sharing your work. All the best with getting those publications out and getting that thesis completed. Everyone says it's always the question you don't ask is when are you going to be done with your thesis, but no one wants to answer that question. But you've got some excellent work done already. We're backing you. You've done some fantastic work, and thank you again for just taking the time to share it with us. So just a reminder to those of you who would like to ask questions of Kailen, we do have the Q&A box as well as our Facebook live feed for those of you who are watching us on Facebook. Yeah, well, I think we'll kick off with some questions if you're ready for those. Are you happy to do that?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. So a question from Michael Rampedi first. He noticed there was a decline on your graph before the moratorium took place. Is that correct? And why might that be?
So remember, that moratorium was only after the Stockholm Convention was ratified. So before that, when in the 1960s, Rachel Carson's book was published, I think it was published in 1962. Already at that point, there were certain governments that said, no way, we want to stop this. And they preempted that moratorium. And so there were large countries, in fact, North America started banning it as early as the 1970s, I believe it was. So you did have large players and large producers that already stopped it before their formal Stockholm moratorium.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you for answering that one. A question from Penny Abbott on the same graph, I think. Your data shows a lot of variability in the log DDT over time. Presuming there are a lot of variables playing into that. I don't know if you want to speak to that variability.
Yeah, there is a lot of variability playing into that. That was one of the biggest challenges we had on it. Also, the whole reason we went for a log scale is because of such low quantities in certain countries, right? And so, yeah, 100% right. There are a lot of variabilities. So the model that we used, we ran many different iterations of it, and it comes out with that decline, which we're happy with. But you're right, variability is a big issue. Yeah,
I heard it once said that if you publish or if you do an analysis in biology and you come out with perfect results, there's something wrong, because biological systems don't work that way. There's always all these intertwined variables and systems that we need to work in. So we do have to deal with this variability. We have to be very adaptable people as biologists, say, Kailen.
Very much so. Very much so.
All right. So there's a question here from Chris Curtis saying, firstly, great study. Well done. Have there been any other regional studies on South African birds in areas where spraying still happens? For example, in Limpopo and Maputaland, from Chris Curtis at the UJ.
Yeah, they have. So not only on birds, so there has been studies on pelicans, I believe, in KZN, but also on humans. There was a study or two done on breast milk in humans. And you would imagine, right, that the spraying of DDT in these areas is not just random all over the place. It's actually in the eaves, so it's on the buildings themselves. And so you would imagine that people would be getting contaminated with that. And yes, the studies were showing higher levels of DDT than anywhere else in the country.
Interesting. I mean, I've had long chats with my buurvrouw in the office here, Linda van den Heefer, who I think you will know well from the lead task team, about lead in vultures and that, and she's of the opinion that for a lot of people, the only way you're going to make poison and toxin issues relevant is not to preach it through birds, but it affects on humans. So I'm glad to see that people are looking at that, because that can be a very convincing argument, right?
100%. That is exactly it. And especially with something like DDT, we see it works, and it, something that affects you 10 years down the line or affects your grandchildren is a lot less scary than malaria, which affects you tomorrow. So it's difficult to get that across, but to try and find the way where we can get the best of both worlds, the protection from malaria, but also the reduction in non-target contamination is what we're looking for. I think there's many studies. There's actually studies in Caracal in the Western Cape. Rob did the initial DDT studies in black harriers. It's things like that where there is no spraying that's going on. That's where we want to find out is, why is it there? In KZN and in places where the spraying continues, yes, we expect it to be there. But in places where it hasn't been and it's not allowed to be, why is it there? And that's, I mean, I didn't present the data that we found in our most recent paper that we're working on, and that's on dieldrin, which is another organochlorine pesticide, and it's occurring in places. It's been banned, completely banned, unlike DDT. It was banned in 1983 in South Africa, completely banned. Yet we're picking up levels, not high enough to cause death or anything in birds, but levels that kind of suggest, well, there's recent use. Where is that coming from? Especially for toxin that's been banned completely since the late 1980s, or early 1980s at least.
Yeah, relevant questions for sure. We'll have to get to the bottom of that. And I know I haven't been too involved, but I guess BirdLife South Africa is now employing an ecotoxicology position. So hopefully they'll be able to dig a bit deeper into those kind of questions. You mentioned Rob Simmons. Rob's actually got a question in the Q&A box, so maybe I'll give him the soapbox now. He says, do you have similar, in brackets, declining burdens data from South Africa in, for example, the Western Cape, where DDT is banned, versus KZN, where it's not banned?
So unfortunately, if I remember correctly, the only literature we had from South Africa in birds was Rob's paper. And so those levels were the only ones that we had, nothing comparing areas until now. We've, in the paper that I mentioned that we haven't, that we're still busy working on, that's the only other one that we have in Raptors that we can compare with.
Okay, yeah. You think with such a prominent threat, there would be more research, but I guess that's just a symbol of how the global South has lagged behind and why it makes research like this so important in the long run.
Yeah.
A question from Alistair Stalker, one of our stalwarts here on Conservation Conversations. He would like to say, well, he'd like to ask if there is any recent data from Botswana and South Africa where we know DDT is still being used. You touched on it a little bit, but yeah, it seems like that data is scant, at least in birds.
Yeah, so we do have, there are a few papers on things like crocodiles, caracals, and things like that. In terms of birds, raptors in particular, ours is the most recent one that we're working on, and that's in KZN. From Botswana, nothing that we got out of Botswana at all. In fact, even historical stuff. Zimbabwe, there's been some historical stuff, but that was late 1980s, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Wow. Sure. Okay. Big research gap there for sure.
100%.
You mentioned crocodiles and some other aquatic ecosystem components. Leonard Erickson has a question, and he asks, has any study been done on protozoa populations or other aquatic components in dams and lakes. He's noticed a decrease in the number of aquatic birds on their dams. Could this be DDT related potentially?
Wow, it all depends on where they are, and I would caution against jumping to a specific toxin before you get hard evidence of what it is. I mean, it could be a wide variety of things actually, but yeah, it all depends on where he is.
Okay, all right. So don't jump to conclusions, but you're not going to rule it out.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Another one from Rob then. What's your working hypothesis on how dieldrin gets into our ecosystems if it's been banned for so long? Is it persistence in the landscape or illegal use?
So I think it's a combination of possibly illegal use, but also potentially poor storage. There are farmers, I've had just conversations with farmers that have actually told me that they've got stockpiles of dieldrin in their sheds. They were there. They when it was allowed, they used it. It was in the shed, and I would assume it's not really stored correctly. So there's a potential for leakages and things like that. There was a farmer not too long ago, maybe a year or two ago, that told me that his family member, actually, she was looking for something in the shelves in one of the storerooms, and an open or a jar tin of dieldrin fell on her, and it doused her in dieldrin, and she died from dieldrin poisoning. So the fact of the matter is they're still out there. There are still stockpiles out there in properties throughout South Africa that are potentially not stored correctly, and so that opens the door to accidental contamination, not necessarily illegal use, but accidental contamination. I know there was a study in South Africa done specifically on obsolete chemicals that are stored and housed incorrectly throughout the country. While we do have a lot of legislation to it, the implementation of that legislation is very difficult. How do you go to every single farm throughout the country to make sure that these chemicals are kept correctly or disposed of correctly? And so I think for Rob, I would say my working hypothesis is either illegal use, but not necessarily commercial illegal use, more for local pest management, because dieldrin was used, which is for termite control. And so there could be a potential for that. But a large part could be coming from just poor storage of obsolete chemicals.
Okay, yeah, very interesting and insightful. Thanks for that. Question from Peter Fleming. He says he's under the impression that the chemical is still being used in Kruger National Park. Do you know anything about this?
Which chemical would that be?
DDT, yeah.
DDT, yeah, in certain parts, yeah. So anywhere where there's a high malaria risk, it'll be used. But again, according to law, it will be used in a very restricted manner, and it's only government use. So you can't go out and buy DDT, for example. You'll have to. There will be a dedicated team that comes to use it, that has been trained to use it and how to use it.
Okay, at least that's some sort of consolation, I guess, then.
Yeah,
Given the negative effects that can occur, at least it is being properly regulated.
Yeah.
So Carol Weber has asked, you've reported on the last 60 years and what you found. What's likely in the next few years regarding the use of DDT? What's the future of DDT in South Africa?
So there are moves to change to more or to less persistent pesticides, alternatives to DDT. There's always, I mean, we're always adapting, always evolving in our technology. And so there are other products that are coming out that are less persistent than DDT, and so that's a hope. The problem is currently they're more expensive, and so to do the same thing will start costing a lot of money. So, but I'm hopeful that we will be moving towards the less persistent alternatives. Also, it's important to know that the half-life, in the last 60 years, how DDT deteriorates in 30 years, the first 30 years, won't be at the same rate as what will deteriorate to the 30 years after that. It's not an equal or a linear, let's say a linear decline. So it all depends, again, on the different variables in the ecosystem.
Yeah, good point. Sue Whitelaw was asked, just organophosphates, do those have an effect on eggshells?
Not to my knowledge. But again, I didn't study the organophosphates, but to my knowledge, I don't think they have an eggshell thinning impact.
Okay, so there might be other environmental impacts, but not in the same way as DDT and these other chemicals.
Correct. Even organochlorines, not all organochlorines cause eggshell thinning. So DDE, which was that metabolite of DDT, the breakdown substance of DDT, DDE specifically has that effect on eggshells. Dieldrin, for example, is a very, very neurotoxic chemical. It causes a lot of neurological disorders. And so, in fact, and that's the interesting part that we found with this, is that those declines that I spoke about, those catastrophic northern hemisphere declines of the peregrines and the sparrowhawks, it wasn't just DDT. It was the combination of DDT reducing the eggshell thickness, combined with things like dieldrin causing neurological damage. And so eggs were breaking under the adults, and then adults were dying from the neurological damage. It affects their navigation, their ability to hunt, and things like that. So the combination of them was what was causing this huge decline in raptor populations of the global north. And that's why Rachel Carson's book back in 1962 highlighted that and said, you'll see in a book, she doesn't speak exclusively about DDT, but organochlorines as a group, and that is what prompted that movement to ban and regulate organochlorines as a whole. The Stockholm Convention, actually, they identified 12 organochlorines in particular that was of serious risk that needed to be addressed immediately, and they dubbed it the dirty dozen. And that's what they concentrated on first, I think. And I would imagine they've actually added to the list as time has gone by. Yeah.
Okay. Great insight. Thank you. Question from both Brenda Horner and Louise Kutsia, just asking if there are stores of DDT that need to be disposed of, how can it be safely destroyed?
Okay, so that's where you have to get the municipality involved. There are governmental units that actually come out and remove and destroy obsolete chemical, any obsolete chemical, in fact, anything that has been banned by the government. You can contact them. I do not have those details. Hopefully I'll get them for you, and we can share them with the group sometime. But yeah, that has to be reported to the municipality. It is their mandate to come out and collect.
Okay, good to know. People can then find the right people in their specific contexts. Yeah. There was a comment from Hillary in the chat box, which I just want to pick up with you, saying, firstly, just thanks for the wonderful talk, but secondly, hopefully a malaria vaccine will take over the heavy lifting in this issue. What's your take on the progress on a malaria vaccine, and how do you see that playing a role in the context of what we talked about tonight?
Yeah, that would always be great, but we all know how a lot of people feel about vaccines, right? So it may be a difficult sell, but my view is prevention is always better than cure, right? So we've got fantastic stuff that we can use without using product names, the repellents that work phenomenally. That you don't need to take all these chemicals and things like that. So, but anything that we can use to reduce the amount of DDT use, I'm in favor of.
Cool. One last question just to end on, and this one's from Penny Abbott again, just saying she's been following your work for about or just over 2 years, and really been wonderful to watch your progress. Where to from here for Kailen Padayachee?
That is a good question. That is a great question. Ecotox, I've been bitten by the ecotox bug, right? I never saw myself as an ecotoxicologist when I started off, but through this study in particular, I've seen a gap in South Africa, specifically when it comes to contaminant studies. We are really lacking in monitoring in all types of environmental contaminants. And so I see myself continuing on this path, the ecotox route with birds of prey in particular, but not only birds, all potential bioindicators, because there is a huge opportunity for us to continue this work.
Okay, well, may you go forth and plug that global south gap in this research, this very important conservation research that you and others are involved in. That's it for tonight. Thank you so much for coming on the Conservation Conversations webinars platform. We've really enjoyed it. It's been wonderful to have you on. I know you've spoken at various other BirdLife engagements like Flock and Lab, and we've always enjoyed having you with us. So thanks for joining again. Wonderful to chat to you, and thanks for sharing your insights.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It was a pleasure chatting to all of you. Oh, the power's on.
How's that for timing? Brilliant. All right, well, you go and put the kettle on or whatever you're going to do with your newfound electricity. The rest of us are going to call it a night. And yeah, I hope to see everyone back in 2 weeks' time. We have Cliff Dorse on, who's going to be talking about the City of Cape Town's biodiversity management plan. Of course, Cape Town named as the most biodiverse city in the planet, with the challenge that has happened on an annual basis for the last few years. So really keen to hear from Cliff, who is one of my good birding friends, and I would say one of my heroes of birding in South Africa. He's just an all-around gentleman, and I can't wait to have him on the platform. So join us in 2 weeks. My co-host Christina Hagen will be leading us through that one with Cliff. So yeah, thanks Kailen, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Good night.